So thanks, Alyssa, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So I think Alyssa's just given us a really good overview of myself. But I'm going to go into a little bit more about the background and the context for these conversations and the roadmaps that we've created. And I've been a little bit on brand, so I created my presentation in SharpCloud. It's the first time I've done it, so if things don't entirely go to plan, then that is the one area that I'm least experienced with SharpCloud about. But I'm going to go into a little bit of the application that we have at the AMRC and the context. So I think Alyssa's just given a good introduction to myself, so I'm going to skip on to the AMRC. And I don't know how much you guys know about the AMRC and what we do, but we're a research department within the University of Sheffield in the UK. And we do industrially focused research where we help to translate the great ideas that academia has always had into real industrial applications. We currently have in excess of 120 member companies, and you'll recognise a whole host of the names on screen here. So Alyssa's just mentioned some of these. So we work with both Boeing and Airbus in the aerospace sector, along with a significant number of their supply chain companies. So companies like Rolls-Royce, Safran Landing Systems, Spirit, GKN, and then also a host of other companies. So McLaren, and then all of the supply chain companies across around the world that you'll be familiar with, from very large OEMs all the way down to little SMEs. And essentially all of these companies come to the AMRC for really unbiased, impartial advice about how to improve the productivity of their processes. And that's really why we put our technology road mapping approach in place. So we've been working with technology roadmaps now for in excess of 10 years. We started off discussing with the Institute for Manufacture at Cambridge University about 10 years ago about how best to do that. And like many companies, we started with a number of paper-based or Excel-based roadmaps that we would have to update for each new iteration and for each new scenario. That quickly became quite complicated for us because we work across a number of different technology areas. And you'll see here the main technology threads that we have within the research that we have underway at the AMRC. So we look at high-value design and prototyping, component manufacture in both composites, additive and castings processes, so subtractive processes, so most people know that as machining, but we also then look at automated assembly and smart factory or digital manufacturing, and then at the end of the chain, inspection, validation and test. And we have a number of key themes that run throughout those. So there's a heavy lean towards sustainability at the moment, and obviously digitalization. So when we're putting our roadmaps together, we need to think about how the solutions that are developed in one technology area might be applied to a whole range of other technology areas as well. The AMRC is also part of something that's known as the High Value Manufacturing Catapult in the UK. And the catapults were set up by Innovate UK, who are the UK's research and innovation funding organisation, and they were set up to bridge the gap between business and academia, essentially fulfilling a very similar purpose to the AMRC of helping to turn great ideas into reality. The catapult itself covers a slightly wider range of technology areas, and is actually made up by 7 different centres located around the AMRC, around the UK. So the AMRC has sites in Sheffield, Rotherham, Preston and Broughton in North Wales, but we also join the other centres, so the Advanced Forming Research Centre in Strathclyde, the Centre for Process Innovation in Wilton and Sedgefield in the northeast of England, Warwick Manufacturing Group at the University of Warwick in Coventry, the Manufacturing Technology Centre in Anstey, the National Composite Centre in Bristol, and our neighbours in Sheffield, the Nuclear AMRC. What that means is we actually have quite a complex scenario which I can show you in our technology tree here. So you'll see there's a number of key technology areas with sub-technology strands related to each of them. And there's a whole range of different sectors that we support across the centres. That means that we have to be quite clever about how we link up our technology roadmaps, but we've also got quite a complex scenario to describe, and hence the topic for today's conversation. I'm now going to move on a little bit to the kind of the background of road mapping for anyone that's not familiar with the subject area, before moving on to some examples of how we've solved things. So technology roadmaps, for those of you that aren't familiar with them, are essentially means used to communicate the dynamic relationship between market needs and technologies that provide solutions to those needs. And typically they're based on a workshopping approach, where we're aiming to generate a number of ideas which tell a narrative which helps us to get from where we are today to where we need to be in the future. And the whole road mapping approach relies on customization of the process to suit the needs of the individuals and the organizations. And that means we need to customize the workshopping approach, but also the means by which we're displaying the information. And it's actually an approach that's been around for quite a long time. So I think Motorola were originally credited with inventing the process, but it's been modified in a whole number of different ways by different companies and different organizations around the world. I mentioned the Institute for Manufacture at Cambridge University. They've been fairly instrumental in developing a number of workshopping approaches through the research conducted by Rob Farr and Claire Farouk there. And they both get to say they actually wrote the book on road mapping that many other people refer to. But a key feature of all of the roadmaps that have been created really is that they provide a structured visual representation of that strategy, which brings together a number of different perspectives. And the flexibility of the approach obviously means that it can be tailored to the organization's needs. But that in itself can cause challenges when attempting to link together different roadmaps across different areas. So we need to be really careful about the architecture and the taxonomy that we use to describe different items in different roadmaps. What it does mean, though, that it means that if we create a structured approach in a database that a piece of software like SharpCloud can visualize, then we can link together across a number of different roadmaps and then start to tell some quite complex stories. So as I mentioned, part of the reason for using roadmaps is they enable us to explore that dynamic approach between different items within a technology development program and link those to the needs. But really what we're looking to try and show is that journey between where we are now and where we need to be in the future. So how we visualize these roadmaps is actually quite important. And there are actually four, I guess, main steps that we need to think about when we're designing this process. First of all, we need to frame the problem. We need to think, well, what's the scope of the story that we are telling? So we need to agree on our unit of analysis, or the scope for that story. We need to think about our target audience, and we need to determine the information that the audience needs to be able to understand that information. And when we're planning the process, there's a whole host of questions that we should be asking ourselves to tune the approach to our needs. We also need to think about the structure of our story and develop an appropriate layout that tells the story in terms that the audience are going to be clear and be able to understand. We then also need to think about how we're going to be displaying the relationships within this story. And typically within a road mapping story, we're looking to explain three key questions. So the first of those is typically why. So why are we looking to put a solution in place? The next is what. So what are the deliverables that we need to create as part of these activities? And then the final question is how. So how are we going to solve those problems? And by establishing relationships between those items, we can tell the audience how we're going to be getting from where we are today to where we need to be in the future, and what that's going to enable us to do. And then equally, as part of visualizing that, we need to think about how we're going to establish that sequence. So how we're going to show direction in our stories, and how we're going to highlight the movement from one item to the next. So they're the key concerns. And there's a whole host of background and information that's available on a number of websites. But there's quite a good one run by Dr. Clive Kerr at Cambridge University, which explains some of the thinking about how to visualize some of these stories. Now I'm going to go on to a little bit about the context here and why this is important. Traditionally, roadmaps have been used to identify technology developments that are required by different organizations. But from our own perspective at the AMRC and in the high value manufacturing catapult, we've started to think about the other legs and the other aspects that need to be addressed at the same time as well. So if we're going to anchor innovation in our manufacturing communities more successfully, it's not only the technology aspect that we need to look at, we also need to think about how we bring along the workforce and also the industry base and the supply chain if we're going to create real economic impact. And that means that we can start to look at the competencies and capabilities of our workforce, and also the barriers to adoption that need to be resolved within the supply chain. And that gives us it starts to complicate the scenario. So we need to integrate the activities from each activity. So typically we're starting to think about this as being our traditional road mapping approach. So we need to capture the opportunities, we need to identify the market trends and drivers, any sector strategies that are in place, and the innovation resources that we need to put in place to start answering those problems. Once we've done that, we can also start to think about the related items. So in terms of legislation, finance and standards that might be required in the industry base, and also the competencies that we need to think about from a skills and workforce perspective. And we then can think about, well, if we're able to foresight these things, how do they interact with each other, and build on the layers of complexity to work out how that will be done. If we do that correctly, though, we can start to think about, well, what's the end goals? What are our measures of success for this activity? Obviously, from a technology perspective, we're looking to create the right enabling innovation infrastructure and the answers to the research questions that industry needs. That will hopefully ultimately lead to an agile and competitive industry base that's able to take advantage of those opportunities. And to do that, they will need a skilled and adaptable workforce with the right combination of competencies and capabilities to use that knowledge. And if we can do that, that's when we know we'll have created lasting impact. So moving on to the solution that we've employed at the HVM Catapult and at the AMRC now, we actually started to think about those why, what and how questions, and thought about, well, how do they apply to the different sectors and technology areas that we work in. And apologies, I think this has come out a little bit blurred when I've imported this image. But what we quickly realized is that there's actually quite a lot of overlap between the different areas. So if we take the perspective of a sector or an industry view of the problems that we face, there'll be a number of manufacturing trends and drivers which are common to that sector. And they quite often take the form of those why statements that I was describing earlier on. If industry is going to solve those trends or drivers, though, it's going to need some new capabilities. And they're essentially the what questions that fit into the traditional roadmap structure. And those capabilities will be solved or will be created by implementing a number of research or innovation outputs. And that fits quite well with the traditional structure that most companies use. If we then think about the technology perspective, though, and a lot of the time in our own case, we're thinking about that from an academic perspective. If we ask the same questions of why, what, and how, they actually shift down a level in this structure. So if you talk to a technologist, frequently their why question actually maps to an industry capability that's required. So you might ask somebody developing an additive manufacturing process why they're doing something, and they will describe that they're doing it to provide a new capability, to enable us to make a particular shape or geometry component in a new material in a new way. So there's quite a good correlation between the industry capabilities that sit at the what level of a sector roadmap and those which sit at the why level in a technology roadmap. Equally, if you ask that same technologist what you need to do to provide that capability, they start to describe an innovation output which is very similar to the how description that an industrialist would give. And then you have the additional challenge that sits below that. If they know what the innovation output is, the how question that a technologist needs to answer is, well, what questions, what challenges do I need to address to get us to that stage? And they're the traditional research questions that the academia would answer. And then if we can create the correct structure with our roadmaps, we start to end up with this matrix type of organizer or type of structure. And you can see in here, there will be a whole number of sectors that our roadmaps or the outputs of our roadmaps will be able to influence, and they'll be supported by a range of different technologies, each of which will have their own roadmaps. What we've been able to do by building this architecture into SharpCloud is actually utilize the ability to host an item in one story, but make it available to a whole range of other stories through the enterprise solution. So I'm going to give you a quick example of that here. So the first example that I'm going to bring up here is actually a section through our aerospace technology roadmap within the HVM catapults. And this is looking at part of our propulsion or future propulsion roadmap. And you'll notice here that there's been a number of sector trends and drivers that have been identified up at the top level. And many of those are going to be familiar based on conversations that the aerospace industry is having currently. So obviously environmental impact is one of the hot topics in aerospace at the moment. Reduction in total cost, safety and security is always important. Fuel efficiency is a big driver, and there are a whole range of other perhaps lower ranked trends and drivers in place. And if industry is going to achieve those things for its future aircraft, and with it in this context, develop engines which enable those future aircraft to be developed, it's going to need a range of capabilities. Those capabilities in turn are going to rely on a whole range of technology outputs. And I'm going to call out one of those in particular here. So hopefully if I move my cursor down to the bottom here, you'll see an item which is labeled as in-process control. I can open this up in context, and we can see where it exists in the story. And hopefully it's going to show me there we go. It's going to show me the relationships in sight for this item within the other stories. And what you might pick up is you might notice that actually this item is hosted within another story. So this item is actually coming from our HV and Catapult additive manufacturing roadmap, but is shared between these two stories. So straight away we can make the link between our technology roadmap and the sector roadmap that it applies in. And then I can go into this roadmap itself, and we can see the context of how it was created and where it fits within the story. And you'll see this same item within the context of the story that it's created in, and also by the team that it was owned by as well. And obviously we can then delve into the level of detail there. So very quickly we're able to build up this quite rich story about how the particular items have been created and how they're being used across different stories. And from a funding perspective, that means that we can start to delve into a much greater level of detail than would have been possible previously. Because we can start to think about funding opportunities. We can start to think about using this information to build a business case. So in this particular example, we've identified that in-process quality control is an output that's required by industry to solve a number of problems. Traditionally, we might have known quite easily that the aerospace sector needs that problem, but we might have had to have done quite a lot of digging to understand which other sectors could make use of the same solution. So it would have been a little bit more complex to build the business case. But by utilizing this information in SharpCloud, we're able to quite quickly see which stories the item is in use in. Again, by looking at the relationships and the relationship insight piece. And we can quickly identify which other items this is related to, and hence quite quickly build up a very detailed picture of the use cases for it. And we can also look at all of these other items. The other thing that we can very quickly do is we can change our perspective on the story. So if I was presenting this information to a particular user group, then I could then think about, well, actually, how do I want to filter this? And I could switch very quickly between a whole range of different scenarios for this knowledge, and show how different information is being used to suit the audience. And traditionally, that would have required the complicated construction of a whole range of different views to tell that story. So that's one quite good example of how we're using SharpCloud to communicate the complexity of our roadmaps. Now I'm going to move on to a different example. So through this process, we've actually created quite a wide number of roadmaps. And one of the challenges that we were posed by the people that we were sharing them with was actually how do I navigate these stories quite quickly. So we created this dashboard view to navigate these stories. And you'll see here there's a whole range of different technology competencies that we have here at the AMRC. We use a visual representation of these competencies, which is actually consistent with our website branding for these areas. So the members that we work with gain familiarity about what these images look like, and so can quickly navigate to the stories that are of interest. I'm going to delve into one of these today, which is castings. And you'll see here that not only do we have our technology roadmaps linked here, but we can also link to our capability guides, which list the equipment and the competencies that we have, and also the key staff that we have working in those areas. I'm going to focus on the technology roadmaps today, and you can see that very quickly we can link to both our ferrous and our non-ferrous roadmaps. And I'll open up one of those examples today, and you can see obviously we can link very quickly from one story to the next and navigate around that space and identify where we are delivering items. And our members have found that very useful to navigate between our stories very quickly. So that was that was another good example of how we're dealing with that complexity level. The final example I'm going to share today is actually around data input, because that was one of the challenges that we were faced with quite early on. Is obviously SharpCloud's very good for displaying very detailed data sets, but a lot of our industrial members were initially quite cautious to input information to it, because they were scared of breaking the story or influencing the story in ways that because they didn't understand exactly how the stories were working. So I think forms have been available for a couple of years now, and we're making quite extensive use of those forms to allow our members to input information to the stories. And depending on the scenario for the activity that we're running, we either allow our members to directly input into the stories, or we put in place a check, which means that our roadmap owners have to approve items before they're added to the story. We've also thought quite a lot about the process that we ask people to follow in the workshop. And that's actually quite an important step, because the traditional approach that people use for road mapping is based on, I guess, the established norms of how people work with post-it notes and with pens. And there are whole books actually written on the subject of that interaction. And we've had to think about how that works in a digital environment. And I'm sure you'll be familiar with the scenarios of if you face somebody with a challenge of interacting with a computer or a tablet or some form of device, they actually become quite focused on the device itself, and often forget about the other people that are around them. So what we've had to do is actually encourage a certain set of behaviours within our workshops. First of all, we'd like people to think about the idea that we've asked them to consider in the workshop. So we want them to form that idea. We then want them to talk about it to the peers around the table, which helps them to develop that idea further, and really start to crystallize that, and form essentially a norm for the group. And it's only once they've normalized that view with their peers that we then want them to input that into the story. And it's at that stage that we're asking people to utilize the forms within SharpCloud to add the items. And we've made that as easy for them as possible, so that actually this view on the left here at the moment that I'll zoom in on is actually a slide from one of our workshops. So this is describing the task that we would like people to carry out. It's describing how they would like them to do it. It gives them a view for the form that we're asking them to use. And we've also tried to make it as easy for them to access this form as possible. So when we actually created this slide, I don't think the option to utilize QR codes directly in SharpCloud was available, so we generated them separately. But for those of you familiar with the software, you'll now notice that you can generate a QR code for all of the forms that you've created in SharpCloud and share that with members of a workshop. We've taken a snapshot of one of those QR codes and included that on the slide here, and we found that actually works quite well in a workshop environment. People can access those using either their smartphone or their tablet. And we've also found that for people working on laptops, that utilizing a tiny URL like that at the bottom of the screen is also quite effective. And that means that people don't have to input the full URL for the forms. The other thing that we tend to do is we tend to encourage people to work on the forms on their own devices, but we'll then show a dynamic view of the roadmap that we're creating with the correct filters present on the screen, either at the front of the room if we're road mapping in person, or on the WebEx or the Zoom call that we're sharing with the participants of the activity, and that means that they can obviously work quite comfortably on their own device in front of them, but can then see the items being added in the right context at the front of the room, and that helps to obviously cross-fertilize ideas between the different groups of people that are involved in the workshop session. So yeah, I guess that's the three examples that I was wanting to share today. We've obviously made quite extensive use of SharpCloud to link together our different stories over the last couple of years, and really that's been facilitated by the developments around the enterprise version of the software that I think came out about 2 years ago, and also the widgets and forms that have been introduced more recently, and we've really found some benefits from doing that. I think what I would say though is it does actually require quite a lot of thought about the architecture of the stories that go in the background, and hopefully I've explained the thought process that was required to make that happen in the background. I think it's quite a powerful tool though, if you can get that architecture right, and it's really helped build our storytelling approach to our technology stories.